You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome. I'm Kenneth Igbomor. On the show today, we'll find out what Nigeria's development priorities should be. As always, you can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow my handle at Kenneth Igbomor. The next 2019 elections is a huge opportunity for the country to reshape its development trajectory. I have with me here Andrew Alli, the former president and CEO of the African Finance Corporation, who joins me as we discuss how Nigeria should prioritize its development. Thank you so much for your time, Andrew.
Hi, Kenneth.
Yeah, so very interesting. We're seeing, interesting times going into an election year. We know all the wranglings we've seen so far. I'm trying to look at the task ahead. Basically, as someone who's been into development, I want to start with talking about where you see us positioning ourselves for economic growth.
Well, I think that, there's, to be frank, quite a daunting task ahead. For anybody who really wants to move the country forward. I mean, when you look at some of the statistics, they're really quite worrying. I've seen some reports published recently that say that there are something like 13 million children who aren't attending school, which makes Nigeria, the country with the largest absolute number of people out of school. The World Bank recently published a Human Development Index, which showed that Nigeria came 152 out of 157 countries surveyed. These statistics really talk about, how we are turning our citizens, or how we're not turning our citizens into productive people who can live fulfilling lives. This has, worrying implications, not just for economic growth and economic development, but also for social growth and social development. Again, it's been shown, for example, that where you have large numbers of unemployed young people, especially unemployed men, you're more likely to get, political violence and things like that. So this is a really worrying problem. And, we really need to think about how we can set ourselves up to reverse these trends and really to develop our people and position them to be effective citizens and effective people in a 21st century world.
All right, very interesting point. So the need to prioritize human capital is top on the agenda right there. But I also like to look at, how we should, as a country, position to attract investment.
Yes.
Yeah, because we're going into a time where we've seen how we just recently had a lot of capital flight from the foreign portfolio investors, and then even FDI it's not at levels that it should be as we expect. What do you think? Still looking at the task ahead, as a country going into an election cycle and going to a possible new leadership coming up in February next year, how do you think we should try and prioritize who we pick to drive this narrative?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we need to focus on something that is really not very sexy, but is very important, which is a macroeconomic management. Even the word itself sounds a bit funny. But really balancing your macroeconomic environment, which is things like, how much are you spending, how much are you earning, is there a balance between that, is really what allows the government to have the fiscal space to make investments. And it's highly tied in, actually, with what I was just saying about social development indices, because, a lot of these things have to be, the government has to make investments into human development, for example. Now, by balancing or achieving a macroeconomic balance, that frees up, gives the government continued access to capital to make those investments. But at the same time, those are the sorts of things that in the long term attract investors. I did some analysis a few weeks ago, and I found that if you basically change dollars into naira and hold it for a 5-year period, you have a 90% chance of losing money. That is, there's a 90% chance of there being some sort of devaluation event in any 5-year period. And all this comes to how you're managing your macroeconomy. Right now we've heard statistics that the level of debt service as compared to government revenues is extremely high. There are a number of figures being bandied around. I've heard up to 60%. So 60% of what the government earns, up to 60%, is being used just to service debt. Again, again, a large proportion of government revenues is being used to pay salaries. So by the time you add debt service and salaries, before you even talk about anything else, we're already borrowing. And these are things that really need to be long-term sustainable. And then that doesn't give the government any space to invest in things. At the same time, having a stable currency regime, currencies are not stable, they're not fixed, they move up and down, but having a stable currency regime without the sort of shocks that we've had in the past is one thing that attracts investors. So at the same time you're sort of bringing a better macroeconomic balance, not only are you providing longer term access to funds by the government, but you're also creating an environment that attracts investors in the long term. I mean, and those investors, by the way, we all talk about foreign investors, but domestic investment is very important as well. Nigeria, domestic savings on a macro basis for both government and individual, and savings is the same thing more or less as investments when you look at this, is about 15%. That number is equal to the UK. The difference is that the UK has far more capital stock than Nigeria. If you look at most fast-growing Asian countries, that number is closer to the mid-30s. China is 50, and many African countries are in the mid to late 20s. So again, this is part of this whole macroeconomic thing. It's not something that people like to talk about. It's boring, it's technical, but it's highly important.
I know it's very important, but I would like to ask you this very direct question. By how much do you think our decision making in 2019 will impact our development trajectory as a country?
So a lot of these things are what I call important and not, but maybe not urgent. So there's some things that are important and urgent. So if you can't borrow money and you're having a crisis, that's important and urgent. Both the human development I talked about and also this macroeconomic issue are important but maybe not urgent, in the sense that, if you don't tackle them this year, the country isn't going to go down in flames.
Yeah.
But, it's something that you really, and which is also, by the way, perhaps why it's not faced, because these things are not vote winners, because, you do something this year, the impact may be in 5 years, 10 years time, not within the next election cycle. Going and opening a power plant or a railway or something like that, gets you immediate kudos. But these things are really investing in the underlying system that keeps the country going. So in a way, it's very important. And, if people truly care about the development of the country, then it's something they should face. But as I said, it may, unless something triggers, for example, a debt crisis on the macroeconomic side or a foreign currency crisis, it's not urgent. And this is part of the problem with these issues.
Okay, very interesting. I'd like to move on now to more or less trying to address some of the structural issues. Because we know sometimes when you have a structural issue, unless you address it, you keep running around in circles and you're just kicking the can down the road.
Yes.
So first, in looking at first the type of government we run, are we running the most efficient type of government for a country our size and with kind of revenues that we have?
So there's a political aspect to that and there's an economic aspect to that. And if you talk about the political aspect, which I can't claim to be an expert on, we seem to have settled on a system of government that's a federal system, and therefore you have sort of a lot of repetition, if you like. We don't have a centralized system. So we will have a federal Senate, and then we'll have, state houses of reps. And we've decided on that system, because we feel that decisions should be made, more locally than centrally, for various reasons, both historic and practical. I think that that's really up to a country to decide. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer in that. Whether the capacity of some of the states or some of the local governments really to make those kind of decisions, those are, specifics that one can think about. But, generally speaking. But as I said, from an economic point of view, of course, this is not maybe the cheapest system to run, because you have, in this country we have 36 states with the Federal Capital Territory. Each of them has a governance apparatus. Once upon a time, we had 4 or 5 regions that were governing the same country. So, we went from sort of having 4 such systems to 36 or 37 such systems. Obviously, it's you've increased the cost of governance considerably by doing that. But, I wouldn't, I think it's more of a political decision as to how you want to do it. But now, whether, all of the states are really viable as entities, again, is something that, if one had the chance to sort of sit back and look at the big picture, maybe should have been discussed. But I think we are where we are, and to be frank, I think sort of saying, okay, we want to merge 2 states together because they're not financially viable at this point probably isn't a practical suggestion.
Okay. So, but very quickly, so how would you say this is impacting our budgeting priorities?
Well, as I said, by the time you look at what we're spending on salaries, that eats up a very considerable amount of the revenues we have. This is at both the federal level and, when you consolidate the federal and the states. Then the secondary point is, how productive are those people that are being employed by the federal government? Are we, not just the federal government, actually the federal government and the states, are we using them in the most efficient way? Are civil servants and public servants really delivering as efficiently as they can? Now, when you look at the big picture statistics, actually Nigeria's spending as a percentage of GDP, which is different from our spending as a percentage of revenue, is actually not out of line. One of the problems we have is that our revenues are not large enough. And I think going back to the point I was making about macroeconomics, one of the bullets that we have to bite is around taxation and increasing government revenues. And we need to think about smart ways of doing that. In a country where, again, estimates vary, but 50–60% of the GDP is in the informal economy, having a system of direct taxes, which is broadly what we do, is probably not the most efficient way of collecting taxes. So we need to look at how we can widen our base of indirect taxes to capture a lot of the informal economy that right now is just totally out of the tax system. Because while we need to increase revenues, if we keep on going back to the same people, it's not going to work.
All right, then. So we'll keep that thought flowing. We'll take a quick break, and then when we return, we'll continue our conversation. I've been speaking to Alli, the former president and CEO of the African Finance Corporation. As we continue our discussion on Nigeria's development priorities, still with me is Andrew Alli, the former president and CEO of the African Finance Corporation. Andrew, I'd like to take this conversation to a different twist now. I want to look at more or less party politics and how this impacts the final choice of who gets to run the country.
Ooh, interesting question. So I think party politics in Nigeria, and bear in mind that despite, fits and starts, we've only been at this, for about 18, 19 years, and, other countries have been at it for 300 years. So it's still, I think, quite nascent. But party politics obviously is very important, because that's what throws up the candidates that we're voting for. And frankly, to some extent, by the time we, the citizens, get involved in voting at the election, the choice that we're voting for is pretty narrow, especially, for those who want to vote for the mainstream candidates, of which there are two parties. Of course, there are a lot of other people who are vying for different positions and who bring an alternative view. But so how the parties select their candidates, the pool they select their candidates from, these are quite important, and really to some extent, choices have already been made, options have been narrowed well before we get to a general election. So
many times you hear things around zoning, you hear about national character, I want to think that merit should be what should be the driving force for who a party gets to pick on, who they're putting forward, not necessarily what part of the country they are from.
Well, I subscribe to that view as well, and I also would make the point that actually if you go and you look at, and I won't sort of be specific here, but if you go and look at where presidents or governors or what have you have come from versus the development that they've actually brought to their areas, I'm not sure there's a strong correlation, to be frank. Having said that, in a country as diverse as Nigeria, it is important that we have diversity of candidates, diversity of people participating, and that we are not ruled by people just from one region forever, because there is frankly a social dimension to this. I mean, in theory you could say, well, look, it doesn't really matter if everybody who rules us comes from one village, but they're really good rulers, then fine, let's bring them in. But real life never works like that. And the way democracy works, if somewhere has 51% of the votes and somewhere has 49% of the votes, and they all vote strictly on ethnic or regional lines, then you will always get people from the first place coming into power. And in the long run, that may not be a good thing. So I mean, yes, my fundamental point is to say, look, these things should be based on merit, and frankly, people should be appointed on merit. But I think that diversity is something that
basically
is
finding a way to get everybody involved.
And let me say one thing about diversity as well. We talk about diversity around ethnic groups and regions and things, but we also don't talk about diversity around gender. So I was just reading online today that something like only 10% of candidates for their houses of rep and senate or something are women. And this is from both of the main parties. When you look at sort of age distribution, that's also an issue. You go and look at other countries and you see that there are people, frankly, even in their 20s who are being ministers, are running for office, and we don't have this now. I don't believe necessarily that, you're better because you're younger or you're better because you're older, but I do believe that having a diversity of different points of view make sure that all those points of view are taken into account as decisions are made. And that is something we ignore. We focus very much on the ethnic and regional balance.
Another interesting thing I want to bring on board here is, ethics generally. The ethics of electioneering, the amount of transparency we see when parties are raising funds for campaigns and all that. How transparent do you think this is, and what's the ideal you think we should be aiming for?
I think that, again, in an ideal world, campaign financing, how this is done, and there are different models, and I wouldn't advocate one model over another, but I think that this is something that really should, is a bullet that should be bitten at some point. But to some extent, again, if you take the major parties, there's probably not a huge amount of incentive on either side to really change this in any significant or meaningful way, at least immediately, because, I guess part of their strength is their ability to fundraise, and therefore if they change it and in some ways level the playing field, then it allows other people to come up.
In television, there's something we say, you're only as good as your last show. And then I'm now referring to, past elections that we've seen in Nigeria. We recently saw the Osun State election. We also just recently saw even the internal primaries within the parties. When you see the events that have unfolded in the past weeks and months, what worries you the most?
So again, one looks at both the short term and the long term. So in the short term, obviously, the way the election next year will be conducted is of concern. And I was just at a presentation with investors, foreign investors, this morning, and this obviously was one of the questions they asked. And I think that, and I pointed out that actually people often get very worried about the elections in Nigeria. Not that they're always smooth sailing, but we've at least managed to avoid the situation that happened in Kenya some years back when, there was outright, very widespread violence. There is election violence in Nigeria, but it tends to be contained and not widespread. I think that if a large number of people feel that the election results are not actually reflective of the overall will and feeling of the population, then that's when you start to get the propensity for there to be violence. I mean, I think we all understand that we're a developing country, that things may not go smoothly in the election, but I think that, frankly, most elections, the end result has broadly reflected what people wanted. And hopefully this is what will happen next year as well. Because if it doesn't, then I think that's when you can start to get serious problems. In the longer run, you talked about internal party politics. I think that that is one of these things that is very important, particularly in the long run. As I said before, to some extent, by the time you're voting in a general election, the choice has already been made for you to some extent. And therefore, how the parties select their candidates, the quality of democracy within those parties is very important. And obviously, that is something that is, to be frank, largely unregulated or largely self-regulated by the parties themselves. And therefore, you hear different stories about people being told not to stand, even to contest within the party primary, etc. So, those things are things that really, in the long term, if we really want to improve our democracy, we need to get involved in somehow, and we need to see improved.
Very quickly, I'd like to speak to just the role you think the international community can play.
So, I mean, to be frank, I think the role the international community can play is somewhat limited. You have election monitors, for example, who go around every African election And, I mean, I think the results speak for themselves in different countries. I'm not just talking about Nigeria. But I do think that the moral judgment that these guys make does help a little bit. I do think that, they certainly shouldn't withdraw. They certainly should continue to watch what happens, to make comments, because at the margin, it does make a little bit of difference. I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference, but I think it does make a little bit of difference, and it does help somehow.
All right, then. So we'll keep our eyes on, thank you for your time. Very interesting conversation we had so far, talking about Nigeria's development priorities. I've been speaking to Andrew Alli, the former president and CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation. And that's it on Beyond Markets. Thank you for joining us. Remember, you can watch this and previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at CNBC Africa. Stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets and follow me at Kenneth Igbomor. Do have a great day.